Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Immunity Blueprint Summit. Today, we have with us Cece Doucette. She is Technology Safety Educator and Education Services Director for the International Nonprofit of Wireless Education. And some of you may be wondering why we would have a technology expert on an immunity summit. Well, stay tuned. She's going to explain why. Cece, thank you so much for being here. Can you please introduce yourself?
Sure, and thank you for this opportunity. I love that you are doing an immunity summit because today, with all of our environmental exposures, there are so many angles to cover, and it's a real honor to talk about safe technology with this. So I am a technical and professional writer by trade, and when my kids were in school, I used to help run our local education foundation, and we kept hearing about this 21st century classroom and how our kids were going to need all this new technology to do well in the world. So, good doobies, a bunch of us parents jumped in and we started doing fundraising for iPads and Chromebooks and wireless infrastructure and smart boards and what we thought was the right thing to do. And then one night at book group, a girlfriend of mine who's an engineer, she and all four of her children had chronic Lyme disease. So she was trying to figure out what makes a body strong. And in her investigation, she came across a book called Zapped. So at book group one night, she's telling us about this book, Zapped, that she was reading, and indicated that there could be biological risk with today's wireless technology. And, it was book group, so I just kind of made a mental note of it. But then not long after that, I read something that also indicated there's something to know about wireless. So that was my entry point. And I was just astounded. If you do a cursory search, is Wi-Fi safe? You will see studies that were done that lead you to believe everything's fine. I didn't know it at the time, but those were by and large industry-funded studies. But when you go just a little bit beyond that, and you don't have to go very far at all, you will find thousands of studies from all over the world indicating that this technology operates off of radio frequency microwave radiation. So we never even stop to think about how is our data going back and forth? How are our messages? How are our photos? How's it all going back and forth if we're not using wires anymore? Well, it's through data packets that are being carried on microwaves, radio frequency radiation. And some people will say, oh, you have to have enough energy from a transmission to break the bond of the atom. And that's true. That's why we wear protective aprons when we go in for an X-ray, because that's a different kind of radiation. That's ionizing radiation. Down on the spectrum a little lower is the non-ionizing radiation. And so at the low level, non-thermal, meaning you don't have to have heat to have harm, non-ionizing end of the spectrum, we now literally have thousands of studies linking this to biological harm for you and I, especially for children, for the elderly, because it does a number on our cognitive ability, fetuses, because their cells are growing so rapidly, and the elderly, because it does a number on our cognitive impairment. Did I just say that? Point in case. But also anybody with a compromised health system, which brings us back to the immunity topic. So that was my entry point, and that's how I got involved in this issue. And, I thought, when I found out that this is particularly harmful for children because, first of all, they're not just little people. We know that through medicine that their biological cells are still developing, their DNA is still developing, and their central nervous system and their immune systems are still under development. And if you think of a phone, for example, if we put that phone up to our head, it's going to penetrate inside our brain about this far. On a 10-year-old, it's going across about this far. And on a 5-year-old, it's going almost all the way across the brain. And a child's skull is thinner. The science shows that it absorbs 10 times more radiation than yours and mine. And their brain has a higher water content. It's more aqueous, and that causes it to absorb more radiation. So, when you see somebody handing a child an electronic device that operates off of radio frequency, we need to get the education out there, because the message is certainly not no technology. It's safe technology. And I get it. I'm a mom. Sometimes you just got to plunk your kid in front of a screen so you can get dinner on. I used to worship the little Aardvark Arthur on PBS, because I'd pop in a half-hour tape, put my kids in front of it, and then I would go in the kitchen and get dinner cooked. So now we just need to learn how to parent in the technology age, because we are pioneers in this. And let's see how we can do it to safely bring it all together. But we really need to protect ourselves and our children.
That's both fascinating and disturbing at the same time, with the phone and the brain. Can you speak more about the science? What kind of science is out there about how this harms us, and maybe if there's specific studies that you want to highlight?
Yeah. So for a very long time, the industry was able to spin it that there's no mechanism of harm identified in the scientific literature. And at one point in time, that might have been true. We knew something wrong was happening, but we didn't know exactly how it was happening. So, you wouldn't let your kid touch a fire, right? I can't tell you what happens to those cells that make your skin burn and stuff, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to keep my kid out of the fire, right? So we should take precaution even if we don't know exactly how that mechanism of harm is happening. So there is something called the precautionary principle. And in some countries, when we started figuring out that this is biologically active, some countries made a more stringent public radiation exposure limit. Our country did not. We keep pushing these products because it's extraordinarily profitable. But now, in the scientific literature, we know of at least 4 or 5 different mechanisms of harm. One is that when we use this technology, when we use radio frequency technology in a controlled medical setting, we know we can do some really good things. We can stimulate bone cell growth. We can stimulate stem cell growth, right? Mm-hmm. But in this ubiquitous way that we've now surrounded ourselves with all of these multiple wireless exposures all day, all night, it's causing cells to replicate more quickly than we would ordinarily choose to, bad cells included. So we see cancers advancing more quickly. There's some scientific discussion about the COVID-19 pandemic. And we know that this radiation causes cells to rapidly multiply, right? So when you have a virus, it can also perpetuate the virus and cause that to grow more quickly. And Wuhan, China, which was the original epicenter of this, they became one of China's first smart cities right at the beginning of November. And by December, when this coronavirus came through, they had the makings of a pandemic. So,
city meaning they installed more 5G?
Yeah, so within the United States, and 5G just means 5th generation technology. It's not just, the next one after 3rd and 4th generation, which runs our cell phones and a lot of our wireless and stuff now. 5th generation brings in a whole nother set of radio frequency waves at the millimeter spectrum. So these are dinky little waves. 5G can't operate unto itself, so you still have to have all these big cell tower antennas that are put up, for all of our cell phones. But now what they want to do is densify with cell towers. And these little tiny millimeter waves for 5G can, they're spinning it up that we'll have faster speeds and quick downloads, and we can have smart cities and super highways and, self-driving cars. Well, you don't even need 5G for self-driving cars. Engineers know how to do that without it. But in order for 5G to fly, you have to put cell towers every 2 to 12 houses, like everywhere. So the industry's solution is to put millions of these 5G small cell antennas, like right inside our neighborhoods. People are waking up with the trucks coming in overnight or during the day, putting a small cell antenna at the curb right outside their home. The industry would also like to put them on our rooftops. How cool would it be? You'll be the fastest house in the neighborhood. Well, meanwhile, that'll be spraying out to all your neighbors too. So a little later on, we'll talk about initiatives that are ongoing. So don't freak out. Let's first get educated. But in the United States right now, we have about 10,000 of these small cell antennas already installed throughout various test cities and other communities that didn't really know any better than to try and stop it. And in Wuhan, China, they put 10,000 in that one city, right? On street poles, on light poles at, bedroom height. So again, the science will tell, time will tell, but we know already scientifically that radio frequency radiation weakens the immune system. Okay. So in addition to using it in a positive way in a controlled medical setting, we also know that there's something called the rouleau effect, which I kind of think of it as you remember that old candy Rolos where they stack up? It was a chocolate and caramel thing. That's how my brain remembers it. So the rouleau effect means that typically, I believe it's our red blood cells would be free floating and going out and oxygenating all of our body's systems. With this electric magnetic field that is imposed upon our bodies from wireless technology, it's causing those blood cells to glom together like a roll of coins or the candy. And now you've got this stack that can't get to where it needs to go to properly oxygenate, right? So that can be a big hit on our system. So we've got the medical setting, we've got the rouleau effect. We also know that we have something in our bodies at the cellular level called the voltage-gated calcium channels, or VGCCs. And we know scientifically that this bombardment of radio frequency radiation coming at us is dysregulating our calcium influx and flow. So when we've got this constant pulse of microwave radiation hitting our cells, it can create a leakage at the cell wall. And from there, you now have this dysregulated calcium that comes out and outside of the cell wall can cause this chemical reaction that produces a really nasty free radical called peroxynitrite, right? And now peroxynitrite might go where your weakest proclivity is. Maybe it's breast, maybe it's the breast cancer. Maybe it's going into, reproductive areas. Maybe it's going into heart, wherever. Our bodies are very individual. And we know that this peroxynitrite is a very big component of this. And I would imagine that some people who are in on this summit may also be familiar with intestinal hyperpermeability, or perhaps leaky gut syndrome, as it's called. I was diagnosed with leaky gut right around the same time as I started figuring out all of this wireless stuff. So in my health exploration, I came across the work of Dr. Stephanie Seneff, who's a senior research scientist at MIT. And I watched one of her videos out on YouTube, and it was with the Wellesley, Massachusetts League of Women Voters. And in about a half an hour, she lays it out pretty clearly that in the work that she's been doing, so she started saying, why do we have all these children coming onto the autism spectrum? What's going on? What has changed? And where are we headed? So Dr. Seneff pulled the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control numbers, and she did a trajectory from the 1970s that said, back in the 1970s, we had 1 in about 50,000 children on the autism spectrum. Today, it's 1 in every 40 children, and a lot of them are our little boys. And when you look at that trajectory, just by the numbers alone, by 2032, she's forecasting that we will have 1 out of every 2 children on the autism spectrum, and it will be 80% of our boys. But she said, but that's just the straight numbering. We also have to look at dosage. So what Dr. Seneff looks at is the chemicals that were brought into our agricultural society, the repurposed warfare chemicals like glyphosate and the others that are routinely put into our foods unless we mindfully choose organically grown food. So she said when you layer on dosing, back in the 70s when we had 1 out of 50,000 kids on the spectrum, we only had 10% of our core crops grown with glyphosate, right? Today, 90% of our core crops are grown with that chemical. And when you do that and you layer on the dosing, she forecasts that 1 out of every 2 children will be on the autism spectrum by 2025, which is just 5 years from now. Wow. So I went, you got to be kidding me. And I just, most people don't want to hear this stuff and certainly don't want to believe it. But I've got an investigative mind, so I went right over to my school superintendent's office and I pulled our records for the last 5 years. In that 5-year span, our little tiny school district here in Ashland, Massachusetts, we were up 313% of children with either straight out autism or these learning disabilities that involve all of their communication systems and stuff. So I was just like, oh my gosh, you got to be kidding me. So the reason I bring this up is because Dr. Seneff also talks about peroxynitrite, right? Mm-hmm. So one summer, our local farmers market understood the work that I was doing on the wireless end of it. And they asked if I would like to have a booth to share information with the community at our health and wellness special day at the farmers market. I said, sure. So I brought my table, I brought meters that we can measure radiation, and the rain started coming and I was under an awning and the table next to me said, oh my gosh, we don't have coverage. Can we come in with you? And it was the GMO people. So we kind of made a V out of our 2 tables and we were properly sheltered. And some gentleman walked up and he goes, wireless radiation, or EMFs, which stands for electromagnetic fields, and GMOs. And he said, which do I need to pay attention to? And I said, sir, I totally respect your question, but we're only one body. So we need to understand what all of our environmental exposures are. Mm-hmm. And so that's a very common thing. Is it the food? Is it this? It's kind of everything, but it's not insurmountable. It's definitely intimidating. So I tell people to freak out for 10 minutes when you first figure out that your wireless is not all it's cracked up to be. And then let's come back to the table and talk about solutions. But let me just double back and talk about the biological effects that we know about. So 1 is the medical setting. We use it for good. 2 is the rouleau effect. 3 is the voltage-gated calcium channels. A 4th one that I want to mention is the blood-brain barrier. So we have particular barriers throughout our body. We have a blood-brain barrier. We have a gut barrier. But we know scientifically that this constant pulse of microwave radiation can permeate and open up these sensitive areas that are meant to keep toxins from going in. So now where we've got neurological issues that are often growing in a lot of people and a lot of children, we know scientifically that wireless radiation can open up that blood-brain barrier. So now instead of the blood escorting toxins out, it can take a left turn and go into these sensitive areas where we've never had these toxins showing up before. So the blood-brain barrier is very important. And then the 5th one that I think so many of us can relate to is the impact on melatonin. Mm. So this radio frequency radiation is a light energy form, right? It's invisible, but it's a light energy form. And our brain sees it, even though we don't see it with our eyes. So if we've gone to bed and we've left our cell phone on, we've left our router on, we have the Roku or the Chromecast, we might have a wearable on our wrist, we might have a baby monitor that's cordless. Any of these wireless exposures are going to be pulsing at billions of cycles per second, this spiked, erratic microwave pulse. And our poor brain, in the wee hours of darkness, it's meant to release melatonin. Melatonin goes out and helps to regulate our sleep cycle. It also helps to escort the toxins through our bloodstream and out the body. So now our brain sees this, and it thinks, boy, the lights are on. And it does this all night long. And so our brain is getting dysregulated in its ability to release melatonin from the pineal gland that would then regulate our sleep and help to clean out the toxins from the day.
And it doesn't have to be right next to your bed. It could be just in the room and it's doing this. And
it could just be in the house. So we had Comcast was our internet carrier. And when we got hooked up with them, my husband said, you know, my wife's going to want to make sure that we have no radio frequency on in the house, because when that triple play box came in for the telephone, the cable, and the internet, it is set up to emit wireless radiation all the time. So my husband said, we're going to need to make sure we can disable that. And the tech said, oh, no problem. So he switches out all of our boxes, and then I have a radio frequency detection meter that I'll show in just a few minutes. And I went down to the utility closet, that's where ours is, and I measured, and my meter went off the charts. And I said, okay, did you get the 2.4 gigahertz wireless antenna and turn that off? And he said, yeah. And I said, did you get the 5 gigahertz antenna and turn that off? And he said, yeah. And I said, and now I understand Comcast is using our home as a way to throw internet out to the street so anybody can pick it up going by. So I said, did you get the 2.4 gigahertz hotspot? And he said, yeah, that's off. And I said, what about the 5 gigahertz hotspot? He said, yeah, that's off too. And I said, so why is my meter going off the charts? And he said, I don't know. So he calls his tech support line. They didn't know. He calls his supervisor. He didn't know. He spent hours down in my basement trying to figure this out. So when he left, I had remembered a friend of mine in Silicon Valley had mentioned that there was an additional antenna that he found inside his router. So I got in touch with him and I said, what was it? He said it was already equipped for a wireless home security system, and whether I had that system or not, that antenna was pulsing radiation on the off chance that we might have it. So I said to my husband, you know what, sweetie, let's not get into a position where it might turn itself back on during an update, right? So he went down to, you know, one of the stores, Best Buy or something like that, and he just bought ourselves a Netgear router that has a switch on it so we control those antennas. Mm-hmm. And the nice thing is that once you turn it all off, you have perfectly safe technology. And one of the benefits that most people don't understand is that wireless is really poor quality technology. How many times has the signal dropped? How many times don't we have full bars on our phones? How many times is it a slow connection? Once you hardwire again, which is what we all did 10 years ago, it's not rocket science. It's an Ethernet cable, right? You want to look for one that's CAT means category, and you want to look for something that's at least 5E. E means enhanced. And look for something that's shielded, because they will put foil shielding on the inside of the plastic, and that keeps the radiation from bleeding out through the plastic, and it's a much safer wire if you get shielded. So anything Cat 5E and above, a Cat 5E, a 6, a 6A, that was augmented or something, or 7s. You just want to make sure that you have a shielded Ethernet cable. So we just plug this into the back of our router, right, this end, and then you just plug this end into your devices. Mm-hmm. Right? And a lot of people go, oh man, I remember when my laptop used to have an Ethernet jack in it, but now we bought the MacBook, or now we have an iPhone, and we've got these skinny little, devices that don't have an Ethernet jack in it. So are we out of luck? The answer is no. Yay, there's adapters. So I don't know if we can see this, but I'll read you what it is. This is for a MacBook, right? It's the Thunderbolt to Gigabit Ethernet adapter, and my daughters are both young adults now, so we hooked them up with these, I don't know, 20 or 30 bucks online. It won't break the bank for most of us. And then for the iPhone, who knew? You can hardwire a phone, right? So this is the Lightning to RJ45 Ethernet LAN network adapter, and this works for both the iPad and the iPhone. So most kids today don't actually pick up the phone and call anymore, right?
Right.
If you are going to make a phone call, get a landline again, right? Mm-hmm. This one I think I got for like 20 bucks online with Staples. It's the AT&T CL2909. I like it. It's got big buttons. It has a battery display. So I don't have to have a hardwired cord for electricity on this one, because anytime you add more cords, you're adding more potential for dirty electricity too. So I just kind of like to choose things that are easy. So while I'm working from home, this has a great speakerphone on it. I can put that on speakerphone, and then I can be on my computer at the same time. So hardwiring, as intimidating as it sounds, you can get adapters. There's also a company called Pluggable, and they have adapters for a lot of the Android systems, so the Chromebooks or the Samsung phones or the Google phones. Go out to Pluggable and just poke around and make sure before you buy anything that the make and model of your device, somebody's already written in and said, yeah, hey, it works great, right? So that is not rocket science, right? And then a lot of people like to wear headsets. You want to be very choosy with what you choose, because I'll give you an example. So my mom lived out in Oregon. I'm here on the East Coast. So that 3-hour time difference made it very challenging sometimes to find the right time. You know, if I call her when I wake up in the morning, that's going to be like elder abuse, because it'll be the middle of the morning and the middle of the night for her. And then at the end of the day, you know, raising a couple of kids and stuff, you're pretty harried. So when we'd finally find the right time, I would take my old decked cordless phone, you know, the wireless phones that we all switched over to, and I would stick it in my pocket, and then I would just run a regular wired headset up to my ear, and I would cook dinner, and I would fold laundry, and I would get all my chores done while I'm chit-chatting with my mom. And then I would get off the phone, I go, oh my God, I feel so wonky, like my brain is funky. And it turns out that because I had that cordless phone right here on my body, running up a wire, radiation travels on the wire right up to my brain. Who knew, right? So there are, you know, solutions abound once we know to look for them. And there's a company called Less EMF. And again, that's electromagnetic field, so Less EMF. And I just went out there and I bought a hollow tube headset. So check this out. It's all plastic and rubber up to the head, right? These hook right over your ears. It's got a little ferrite bead that would break any radiation transmission. It's got a nice muting and auto volume control thing here. And then a long enough cord so that if I had to make a call from my cell phone, I would plug it right in, right? Set the device off my body, and then put this up over my head. And mind you, there's no safe level of radio frequency radiation identified in the scientific literature. So let's not fool ourselves into thinking that with a little distance we're safe. We're safer, but there is no safe level of microwave radiation in the scientific literature. And one of the things that I find is very helpful for people, let's say, do either of you have an iPhone?
I do.
Okay. Do you have it with you right now?
Yeah.
Okay, so take out your iPhone and go into settings.
Yeah, I know where to go with this.
And this is a great little party trick, because who would know? Okay, so now scroll down just a little ways and hit general.
Okay.
Okay. Is this a fairly new phone?
It's an 8 Plus.
Okay, let's see. Scroll all the way down to the bottom from general.
Okay.
And second from the bottom, what does it say? Is it
Reset?
okay? Do you have one there that says legal and regulatory?
Yes.
Okay, hit that.
Okay.
And then there should be a little list there of options. And at the bottom, do you see RF exposure?
Yep.
Okay. So hit that. So what we did is we went into settings, we went into general, and then we went all the way down to legal and regulatory. On an older iPhone, from general, you might need to hit about, which is the first one at the top, and then go all the way down to legal. And before we had the newer phones, it was easy to remember. Remember the acronym GAL, like this gal told you how to find the legal fine print, right? So it's either settings to general and then legal and regulatory, or it's settings to general, about, and legal. Once you get into this RF exposure notification, it tells us right there in our phones two really important things. One, this device was tested at a distance away from the body. So don't keep this on your body because it's never been tested against the body, right? 2, use a hands-free option because without forthright telling us, this one device now has 5 or 6 separate antennas that are constantly pulsing independently, 6 separate antennas for a handshake with the nearest cell tower or router. And we don't need that. The message is certainly not no technology. We know enough today to teach ourselves how to use it safely. So in that one device, you now have a cellular antenna, a data antenna, a Bluetooth antenna, a Wi-Fi antenna, a locator antenna, and a public hotspot, right? So if all you have to do is send a text, turn all the rest of them off. If all you have to do is make a phone call, turn the rest of them off. But we would be wise when we're home or when we're at work and we're not on the go, always choose hardwired technology with the antennas off. And that's important because just plugging it into an Ethernet cable with an adapter doesn't turn off the antennas. If you have loved ones who are engineers, get that conversation started. How can we design these devices so that they protect us and give us the technology we need, right? We shouldn't have to figure all this out on our own. And on this journey, I've had the privilege of meeting Frank Clegg, who's the retired president of Microsoft Canada. And when he was raising his family, he knew enough from being in the industry not to have wireless at home. But he didn't really understand it, right? They were software at that time. So when Frank Clegg retired, he wanted to know really, what do we know about this? So Mr. Clegg reached out to a dozen of the world's leading experts on radio frequency radiation. And he came back and he said, our FCC guidelines in the United States are not safe. Canada's Safety Code 6 is not safe. And so now he has formed Canadians for Safe Technology, which is another nonprofit, where their goal is to try and fix this. He's up there in Parliament trying to do what we're trying to do here in certain areas to get public policy caught up to the science. So I know we've talked about biologically what we know this radiation does, but let's break it down a little bit further. Let's now talk about biologically how do we recognize this? How do we see it, right?
Okay. What are some
So way back when we first discovered how harmful this was, it was when we were developing through our militaries microwave radiation to use in our weaponry and our radar systems. And some people remember the story that one of the engineers or physicists had a chocolate bar in his pocket, and when he got in front of that beam, it melted the chocolate in there, right? So they knew there was a heat component to it. But what our science shows us is that our FCC guidelines only address that heat component. And the scientific literature now shows we have hundreds of thousands. Or let me rephrase that. We are biologically impacted at hundreds of thousands of times less radiation exposure than what those FCC guidelines continue to allow.
Wow.
So in the long run, we know scientifically that this causes cancer. Mm-hmm. So for a lot of years, the industry would spin it, but our own government commissioned a study that wound up costing $30 million. It was through the National Institutes of Health, which has the National Toxicology Program under its umbrella. That is one of the leading world experts on toxins. So they went in about 20 years ago expecting to prove scientifically that cell phones are safe, because remember, 20 years ago, cell phones were the emerging technology of the day. And instead, after an unprecedented 3-day peer review at the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, they had experts from all over the world who work with radio frequency microwave radiation weigh in on this study. And at the end of the day, in their final report, they concluded clear evidence of cancerous tumors and DNA damage.
Wow.
Right? Clear evidence is the highest classification of toxin they can give. So, the industry will try to spin it, oh, those were just rodents. That doesn't mean anything for humans. Well, It's against the law to do these experiments on humans. And yet here we are. We are the experiment with this ubiquitous microwave radiation exposure that we've all been exposed to around the clock now. So the industry will also say, well, oh, that's just one study. You need more than one study to corroborate it. Well, right on the heels of the National Toxicology Study, the Ramazzini Institute in Italy did another large study and reported out findings that corroborated everything we found here. So we are past the point of squabbling over the science. We know scientifically clear evidence of cancerous tumors and DNA damage. And that impacted the Schwann cells of the heart. There was additional evidence for the brain, the acoustic neuromas. Those glioblastomas that people get, that's the brain cancer. And it's no coincidence that they're getting them on the side of their head, right? Yeah. Some folks who are old enough to remember years ago, back in the 90s, there was a brain specialist, Dr. David Perlmutter. Some people may recognize his work today from Grain Brain is a book that he wrote about the food toxins going up and through our brain. Dr. Perlmutter had a woman who was a patient who died of these unusual tumors on the side of her head, right? I guess brain cancer usually would start somewhere within the brain. These were notably unusual because they were on the side of her brain. And I don't remember if it was Dr. Perlmutter or the woman's husband, but one of them was on Larry King Live and said that her tumors lined up with the antenna in her cell phone. And so this became a PR nightmare way back in the 90s. And so the industry stepped up and said, well, that's terrible. We have the money. Let us do the studies. So they partnered with our government. There was a wireless technology research program that was initiated, again, $28 million. And they put Dr. George Carlo in charge of this project. Dr. Carlo hired a couple hundred scientists, and for years they did the scientific investigation. They reported back to the head of the Cellular Telephone Industry Association, as it was called back then, that yes, this does look to be carcinogenic, and children are especially vulnerable to microwave radiation. Rather than invoking that precautionary principle, our industry lobbied heavily and got the Telecom Act passed in 1996, and that's what allowed the industry to come in and start putting cell towers all over our communities. But that started with 300 feet in the air in industrial parks, right? That's where they were to begin with. And then as more people bought in, they needed more and more, so they started encroaching closer and closer. And now, if you can paint it the color of a building, you can slap it on a building, right? Or they're going into medical facilities, or they're putting them on top of medical buildings, or they're going into church steeples, or they're putting them on our schools, right? Mm-hmm. Because anybody who needs a revenue stream, like a church, like a school, like a senior center, it's a great revenue stream when you lease your property to put all of this equipment in with no questioning of the biological risk. Mm-hmm. So we have known, our government has known since the 90s that this is biologically active. And now we've been hamstrung. And when they passed that Telecom Act, they put in this section 704 that says if there's any environmental harm, there's no legal recourse. And I found that out from our town health agent when I was investigating this. And he said, yeah, I worked for a municipality in the 90s. They wined us and dined us. They took us to these banquet halls and hotels. They, gave us this beautiful dinner and then told us, hey, here comes wireless and everyone's going to have cell phone accessibility. But at that point, they set the law that you can't take legal recourse on a cell tower based on health. Well, it says in Section 704 based on environmental, and since then they've begun to interpret it that it means human health as well.
Wow. Cece, can we back up? I want to come back to this, but we're talking a lot about, causes cancers, causes this, that.
Thank you.
What are some everyday symptoms that Emily and I might be experiencing that we think maybe is attributable to something, but it really could be our friendly phone?
That's such a good question. So in addition to the cancers, in addition to the DNA damage, just to cover the other long-term impacts, We know scientifically that this does a number to our reproductive systems, and so there are a lot of people struggling with infertility or miscarriages. And it was actually the sperm studies that got me on my feet. So I started looking, and it's all out there. It's not hard to find. But when I read that they've taken male human sperm and exposed it to a laptop with the antennas turned on, and it changed the DNA, it slowed the motility, and it caused far fewer sperm to be viable in just 4 hours of exposure, right? That was I was like, you got to be kidding me. My younger daughter was just entering high school, and we had gotten her a laptop for Christmas, right? And where is she using it? But right on top of her reproductive organs, right? And now you see parents wearing wearables, nursing their babies, putting the tablet or the cell phone resting right on top of the bump during pregnancy. And that little fetus is absorbing more of this than any other stage of life, right? So the cancers, the DNA damage, the infertility, and the cognitive impairment is another really big one, because it's messing with our capability to think properly. It hits our brains really hard. So when we look at what we might put under the umbrella of microwave sicknesses, that's what they were starting to do research on when they figured out that chocolate bar was melting from the radar in our military. So our military studies have been done for decades. And under the umbrella of microwave sickness or radio frequency sickness, we have things like the sleep impacts that we spoke of. We have headaches, stabbing, searing headaches that our doctors can't figure it out. Nausea, because it impacts the mast cells in the gut. Pain that we can't identify. It might be in the back of the head. It could be our heart is experiencing either a quickness or a slowness. We know the heart is definitely impacted. We know the lungs are impacted. We know the brain is impacted. These are all electrical systems, right? We have EEGs, we have EKGs to measure the electrical circuitry, and this interferes with those signalings. So headaches, nosebleeds, nausea, dizziness, and then this whole, we are at epidemic proportions for anxiety and depression in our highly industrialized nations. And suicide, pardon?
Pre-COVID, we already were.
Oh, yeah. And, the suicidal ideation, we have never had kids being so depressed, having such real anxiety. This is not psychological. This is a reaction to an environmental stressor. But the good news is once we just simply learn about this and have a right to know, that's what we should all have, is the right to know. Even just baby steps, know what that legal fine print says in your very own device. And there was a project that you can get to online. It's called Show the Fine Print. And they've called out, what does it say in an iPad? There's a middle school teacher in a town near me. She figured out the EMF thing, and she built some curriculum and put it in her middle school wellness curriculum. And then not long after she was putting this together, she reached out to me to say there was a little 7th grade girl in her school who had a seizure using the iPad. And it said right in the fine print when those iPads first came out, this can cause seizure and eye problems and all sorts of things. And nobody knows it's there. So we're letting the kids use these in their labs with the radiation. And those have multiple antennas transmitting too. So hardwire with a cable to an adapter and then turn those antennas off. And there's so many benefits. Aside from health, you will get a screaming fast signal with a wired connection. Your reliability goes way up. Your data is much more secure because, any pedophile out on the curb outside of a school with $100 application can hack in to the signals that are going through the air. They might know that your kids are planning to go to Dunkin' Donuts after school today, right? So we should not be allowing our children to be using wireless technology, right? Except in emergencies. And we need to teach them how to use it safely in the interim. So the headaches, the nosebleeds, the nausea, the dizziness, the anxiety, the anger, because this is hitting our central nervous system really hard, right? And it's hitting our immune system. And I'll share a story from a doctor I've met on this journey. She knew her older daughter was emitting these microwave sickness symptoms, pretty classic with the headaches and the nosebleeds and, the sleep dysregulation, and they figured out how to fix that. They were off in a big box store one day, I don't know, like a Target or a Walmart or Best Buy or whatever. And all of a sudden, the little brother starts wailing on his sister without provocation, right? And so they make their, embarrassed excuses and get out of the store. And the little girl looks at her mom. She says, "Mama, don't you get it? When I start feeling like this, he starts doing that." And it was hitting his central nervous system in a different way than it was hitting hers. So he went to anger and violence, right? So on that note, when we talk about the anger and violence, I think we should also spend a minute talking about digital addiction, because it's not just from excessive screen time. We know college kids who are flunking out freshman year because they've gotten so addicted to their gaming devices that they stay up all night long, and then they're too tired to go to class or too wiped out to hack it with their studies. So excessive screen time in and to itself is bad. We need to set limits for what is appropriate. And the Russian health authorities actually just sent out a guideline for schooling from home, right? So there are guidelines available. But in addition to the excessive screen time, we need to know that this radio frequency radiation also hits the same receptors in the brain where we find addictions developing to drugs, alcohol, gambling, pornography, tobacco. So wireless radiation is addictive, right? And people will walk around and say, "Oh, I'm so addicted to my phone. I take it in the bathroom with me. I take it everywhere I go. Ha ha, I'm addicted to my phone." But guess what? If we're not mindfully choosing when and how we're using our technology. I don't know if anybody remembers or knows the comedian Paula Poundstone.
Yeah.
She also does an NPR Wait, Don't Tell Me show. She's a riot. But her son became digitally addicted and flew into those fits of rage like we see when we try and remove the addictive substance, be it alcohol or drugs or whatever. We see that happening now with technology. So if your child blows a nutty, when you say, "Okay, sweetie, you've had enough time, put down the thing," you better be really careful. But other good news is there are excellent resources to help us to learn about this and excellent resources to help us parent through it. My school, unbeknownst to me at the time, became the first in the United States classrooms that says, turn off the wireless when you're not using it. Turn off the devices when you're not using them, or at least put them in airplane mode, because if you put a device in airplane mode and you double check that you got all 5 or 6 of those antennas, then you can use everything that's on it, right? You can use your clock, you can use your alarm, your camera, whatever you've downloaded is there on that device to enjoy. So our schools should be minimizing any radiation exposure. Another school nearby put in kill switches on their wall. And I don't know if you can see this, but it's just, an electronic component that you put on the wall that allows the teacher to control when the wireless is on. And you can put these in your home. This one says 60 minutes, 30 minutes, 20 minutes, 10 minutes, or just off. So again, solutions abound. For us to come up to speed on this, here's what typically happens is you and I are learning about this and we're going to go, "Oh my gosh, this makes so much sense." It's common sense, right? Radiation bad, technology good. Let's find the happy medium, right? And then we're going to want to go out and tell everybody we know because we love them and we want them to be safe. But everybody we know has been told all Wi-Fi all the time is the way to go, the more the merrier, right? So how do we get the credible, peer-reviewed scientific information to them in a way that won't be killer overwhelming, right? So on this crazy journey, I have just been so humbled and grateful to be introduced to many of the world's leading scientific experts on this and doctors who are already treating for wireless radiation sicknesses. So I have worked with Dr. Mikko Ahonen, who is one of the world's leading scientists. He's out of Europe. And out of the UK, a technologist, Brett West, and his wife, Lynn, who does graphic design, social media, and marketing. And the four of us hit it hard. We were all introduced to one another through Dr. Deborah Davis, who's a Nobel Peace Prize co-laureate on climate change. She figured out the wireless issue and is all over it. And she has put up a website called Environmental Health Trust. They have a whole database on what the world is doing about this issue because we're way behind the 8 ball here in the United States. They have scientific advisors on their board. So it's a really great place to go and do the deep dive. And she introduced me, Dr. Ahonen, Brett, and Lynn West. We had this miraculous little 3-month period in which we hit it hard and we took all of this science, all of the international medical best practices for wireless technology or for using technology safely, and we distilled it down to a little nonprofit called Wireless Education. Anybody can go out to wirelesseducation.org, and for less than the cost of a movie ticket, we just need to charge a small fee to keep our little nonprofit afloat. But for less than the cost of a movie ticket, you can take a course online that will only need about a half an hour to complete. We will walk you through the risks, the science, what other countries are doing, and what the medically recommended best practices for safe technology are. And it will kick out a tip sheet that you can print at the end just to hang on your fridge or hang on your office or, you know, wherever your technology is, just with simple reminders. Choose hard wiring, put things in airplane mode when you're not using them, protect your sleep areas. And so we've got that little schools and families course. And then we also did one for the workplace because a lot of employers are issuing cell phones and laptops and tablets with no understanding that they come with risk. And, you know, people might be sitting right underneath the wireless router for 8 hours a day. They might be asked to wear a wireless headset with a microwave radiation transmitter right next to their brain, right? So again, let's teach them how to use things safely, right? But there's also a legal component to this that our towns and our businesses would be wise to come up to speed on. So as we saw earlier with the legal fine print disclaimer that comes with all of our devices, that allows the industry to say, hey, we told you. You chose not to read your manual. That's not our problem, right? Well, our companies and our towns need to understand that Lloyd's of London, Swiss Re, and the other major insurers have long ago recognized radio frequency radiation as one of the top risks. Let that sink in. The insurance companies already know this is a leading risk, and they have put exclusions in their policies for electromagnetic radiation. So what that means is if our towns aren't savvy enough to take the time and learn about this, and these industry representatives come in and say, hey, we're going to give you X number of dollars to put up our infrastructure on your public access way, our town's going to think, great, free revenue stream, right? In those legal documents, they want to be checking to see who's taking on the liability for risk and damages, because more often than not, the industry slips it in there, passes that off to our towns, or passes it off to our businesses. And we've already seen lawsuits won around the world around radio frequency, where somebody had a utility smart meter mounted on their house for, I don't remember if it was water, gas, electric, or maybe today it could be solar. But we need to be mindful of where those utility smart meters are, because you don't want to be sleeping next to one. You don't want a pregnant woman or an elderly person or someone with a health compromise anywhere near those smart meters, because they pulse 24/7. Again, engineers can figure that out. Have it pulse once a month when they do the drive-by reading, or have it pulse once a month when the data has to be sent for your billing. But there was a lawsuit won in Grenoble, France, where somebody became sick from their utility smart meter, and they were awarded, I think, what's our equivalent of Social Security benefits because they became disabled from it. There was somebody in Italy who ironically worked for one of the telecom companies and wound up with the tumors from having to do work with that cell phone there. So this is happening in real time. We had a lawsuit here in Massachusetts where a little boy was getting sick, and for 2 years the parents couldn't figure out, why does he get these headaches, nosebleeds, nausea, dizziness, and then they figured out that when he was home on school break or summer vacation, everything just kind of went away and they forgot about it. Then he gets back into this school, and within 2 days, all these symptoms start coming back. And, they've been bringing him into the nurse's office. Parents would leave work, come get him to the doctors. Doctors run the tests they know to run. And they can't figure out what's going on until they figured out after a break and he was fine, something in that school environment must be it. So they started investigating his symptoms. And that's where they discovered electrical sensitivities or electrosensitivity or electrohypersensitivity. But we're all biological beings, and having this overwhelm of constant dysregulation through radio frequency waves, it's cumulative. So people who feel fine today might wake up tomorrow and have the blood-brain barrier open.
Wow. How great was that? Cece provided so much amazing information.
Absolutely. Such eye-opening information. Who knew that technology was so harmful, or wireless technology was so harmful for us? I mean, you don't hear about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, you don't. And we love our technology, but, and we don't have to lose it. No. We don't want to do that.
Yeah, right.
Understanding actually the facts is really empowering and really beneficial. But there was so much information that we couldn't just put it all in one day.
No, we had to bring her back for more information tomorrow, useful information that we can start using to take action in our lives.
Yeah. She'll provide a lot of practical tips and strategies that we can employ effective immediately. It's really good. And I just love the way she articulates all this science. Really, really fascinating. So
really does back it up with good science.
Yeah. So hope you enjoyed day 1 of Cece Doucette's discussion, and we know you're going to enjoy tomorrow. So we'll see you tomorrow.